I am 52 years old, standing in the middle of Interstate 40 under the scorching New Mexico sun, staring at the receding taillights of my own luxury sedan. I have no wallet, no phone, no water, and not a single dollar to my name. Just 3 minutes ago, my husband of 18 years told me he heard a strange noise and asked me to step out and check the rear passenger tire. The second my hand left the door handle, he locked the doors, floored the gas pedal, and left me to die in the desert. If you have ever trusted the wrong person with your life, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me what state or city you are watching from today. Because what I am about to tell you will make your blood run absolutely cold. The sheer roar of an 18-wheeler flying past me at 80 miles an hour nearly knocked me into the gravel shoulder. The blast of hot air hit my face like an open oven door. I stumbled backward, the heels of my sensible leather shoes sinking into the melting asphalt. I could not breathe. My chest seized up in a violent spasm of pure panic. I blinked through the stinging sweat dripping into my eyes, praying that those red taillights would flare up, that he would hit the brakes, put the car in reverse, and come back. I told myself it was a sick joke. A terrible, cruel misunderstanding. Richard was a respected wealth advisor. He was a deacon at our church. He was the man who brought me breakfast in bed every Sunday for nearly 2 decades. Men like that do not abandon their wives in the middle of a barren wasteland. But the highway stretched out empty and shimmering with heat waves. He was gone. I frantically patted the pockets of my light summer cardigan. Empty. I checked the back pockets of my linen trousers. Empty. My purse, my cell phone, my identification, my credit cards, even my prescription sunglasses were all sitting on the passenger seat of that car. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The temperature out here had to be over 100 degrees, and the air was so dry it felt like it was pulling the moisture straight out of my lungs. I looked left. I looked right. There was nothing but red dirt, dead sagebrush, and a blinding blue sky. No gas stations, no exit ramps, no emergency call boxes. Just the endless, unforgiving stretch of the American Southwest. The denial began to shatter, replaced by a cold, sharp terror that sliced right through the sweltering heat. This was not an accident. The way he looked at me right before he asked me to get out of the car. His eyes were completely dead. There was no warmth, no hesitation, no guilt, just a flat, calculating emptiness. I remembered the odd way he had insisted on taking this specific route. I had suggested we fly to the conference in Phoenix, but he claimed we needed a road trip to reconnect. He packed the car himself. He insisted I leave my spare keys in the kitchen drawer. He handed me my coffee this morning with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Every single detail of the past 48 hours suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He had planned this. My legs gave out. I collapsed onto the dusty guardrail, gripping the hot metal just to keep myself from falling into the ditch. As the shockwave rolled over me, my mind began to connect the dots in a rapid-fire sequence of financial devastation. For 18 years, I had handed over every ounce of control to that man. I built a beautiful, thriving floral design business in our town. I had corporate clients, a dozen employees, and an independent income. But 12 years ago, Richard convinced me that running a small business was causing me too much stress. He told me he wanted to take care of me. He said he was a financial expert, that he knew how to make our money work for us so we could retire early and travel the world. I trusted him blindly. I signed every document he ever put in front of me without reading the fine print. I signed tax, mortgage refinancing papers, and investment disclosures because he would kiss my forehead and tell me it was just standard procedure for managing our portfolio. Our joint bank accounts were entirely under his digital control. My retirement fund had been rolled over into a trust he managed. The deed to our beautiful home in the suburbs had been transferred to a holding company to protect our assets from liability, or so he claimed. Even my health insurance policy was a corporate umbrella plan tied directly to his firm. Everything we owned, everything I had ever worked for in my adult life was completely and legally in his hands. Sitting there on the side of the highway, shivering uncontrollably despite the suffocating heat, I realized the absolute magnitude of my vulnerability. If I died out here from heat stroke, or if I wandered into the desert and disappeared, or if I got hit by a passing truck while trying to flag down help, Richard would inherit everything without a single question asked. He would play the devastated husband perfectly. He would stand at the pulpit of our church and cry, and everyone would rally around him. I was nothing more than a liability to him now, a loose end that he had just untied and tossed out the window like a piece of garbage. I had absolutely no access to cash. I did not even know the PIN to our primary savings account because he changed it last month, claiming there was a security breach at the bank and telling me he would set up a new password manager for me later. I was a 52-year-old woman with literally nothing but the clothes on her back. The imbalance of power was so staggering that it made me physically sick. I leaned over the guardrail and dry heaved into the dust, my stomach tying itself into excruciating knots. I had let love blind me to the basic rules of survival. I had handed the weapon to my executioner and smiled while he loaded it. Cars and trucks whizzed past me in a blur of chrome and roaring engines. I stood up on trembling legs and waved my arms frantically. I screamed for help until my throat was raw and tasting of copper, but no one stopped. To them, I was just a blur on the side of the road. Maybe a crazy person, maybe a trap. People do not stop for strangers on desolate stretches of highway anymore. They keep their windows rolled up, their air conditioning blasting, and their doors locked tight. The sun beat down on my unprotected head, and I could feel my skin beginning to bake. The heat radiating from the asphalt was burning the soles of my feet through my shoes. Dehydration was setting in incredibly fast. My mouth was so dry I could not swallow, and my vision started to swim with dark, fuzzy spots. I knew with terrifying certainty that if I did not get out of this sun soon, I was going to collapse. And if I collapsed on the gravel shoulder of Interstate 40, my story would end right here. That was when the paralyzing fear finally broke and something else took its place. Anger, a tiny, white-hot spark of absolute rage ignited deep in the pit of my stomach, spreading through my veins like wildfire. Richard wanted me to die out here. He orchestrated this entire trip, ensuring we were miles away from any town, any cell tower, any witness before he made his move. He thought I was weak. He thought I was just a naive, trusting, dependent housewife who would lay down and perish quietly in the dirt so he could walk away with millions. He thought I would break down and cry until my heart stopped. The sheer audacity of his betrayal snapped something fundamental inside my brain. I stopped crying. The tears literally dried on my sun-baked face. I was not going to let that monster win. I was not going to die on this miserable strip of asphalt. I was going to survive, and I was going to tear his perfect, hypocritical life apart piece by piece. I stepped closer to the edge of the white line, standing tall, making myself as aggressively visible as possible. The dark spots in my vision were getting larger, and a high-pitched ringing started echoing in my ears, drowning out the sound of the wind. My legs felt like lead. Just as my knees began to buckle for the second time, I saw a shape materializing through the heat waves in the distance. It was a vehicle, and it was slowing down. It was an old beat-up Ford SUV, its dark blue paint chipped and fading under years of harsh sun. The tires crunched loudly against the gravel shoulder as it pulled over, kicking up a massive cloud of red dust that coated my mouth and stung my eyes. The truck idled a few feet away from me. For a split second, a new wave of fear washed over me. What if this was someone dangerous? What if I was trading one nightmare for another? But my survival instincts overrode my fear. I had no choice. I was minutes away from losing consciousness. I stumbled toward the passenger side of the vehicle. The heavily tinted window slowly rolled down with a mechanical groan, revealing the driver inside. I braced myself to beg. I prepared to tell whoever was inside that my husband had lost his mind, that I had been robbed, that I needed to call the police immediately, that I was having a medical emergency. I was ready to plead for my life. But the words died in my throat before I could even open my mouth. Sitting in the driver's seat was a woman roughly my age. She had sharp features, piercing brown eyes, and an expression that held absolutely no surprise whatsoever. She did not look at me with pity. She did not look at me with the cautious suspicion of a stranger. She did not ask me if I was okay or if my car had broken down or if I needed a lift to the nearest gas station. She looked me dead in the eye, her grip tight on the worn leather steering wheel, and spoke in a voice that was eerily calm and chillingly familiar with my exact nightmare. "Get in," she said. 15 years ago, Richard left me at this exact same mile marker. My breath caught in my chest. The world around me seemed to completely stop spinning. The roaring highway, the suffocating heat, the blinding sun all faded into the background, leaving only the sound of her voice echoing in my ears. I stared at her, my mind unable to process the sheer impossibility of what she had just said. She knew his name. She knew exactly what he had done. She knew where he had done it. "Do not just stand there," she snapped, her tone urgent but steady, glancing in her rearview mirror. "Get in the car before he figures out you are not dead and decides to come back to finish the job." I grabbed the heavy metal door handle, pulled it open, and climbed into the air-conditioned cabin. The heavy door slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside. As the SUV pulled back onto the highway, leaving the spot where I was supposed to die far behind us, I looked at the woman sitting next to me. I had never seen her before in my life, yet she held the key to the darkest secrets of the man I had slept next to for almost 2 decades. The scared, dependent victim in me died on that gravel shoulder. As the truck sped down the interstate, heading towards a truth that would destroy everything I knew, the hunter was born. The heavy metal door of the old SUV slammed shut behind me, completely sealing me inside the air-conditioned cabin. The temperature difference was so extreme that my skin immediately broke out in a cold sweat, shivering uncontrollably against the worn cloth of the passenger seat. The vehicle smelled strongly of black coffee, old paper, and a faint hint of peppermint. To me, it was the absolute sweetest scent in the entire world. The engine roared loudly as the driver threw it into gear, tires crunching aggressively over the gravel shoulder before merging back onto the burning asphalt of the interstate. I sat absolutely frozen. I kept my hands pressed flat against my thighs, my knuckles completely white, unable to fully process the reality of my survival. The desolate, sweltering New Mexico desert blurred past my window in streaks of red and brown. My mind was spinning so violently I thought I might be physically sick right there on the dashboard. I tried to look at the woman sitting in the driver's seat, trying to make sense of her sudden, miraculous appearance. She kept her dark eyes glued firmly to the road ahead. Her jaw was set tight. She drove with a singular, intense focus, navigating the heavy highway traffic with practiced ease. She did not look at me with any pity. She did not offer me a tissue to wipe the dust and sweat from my face. She did not offer me a shoulder to cry on or whisper any sweet, empty words of comfort. I was profoundly grateful for her coldness. If she had shown me an ounce of sympathy in that exact moment, the fragile shell holding me together would have shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Instead of comforting me, she reached into the cluttered space behind her seat with one hand, never taking her eyes off the road. She pulled up a thick, heavy manila folder packed tight with papers and tossed it squarely onto my lap. The sheer weight of the file felt like a cinder block hitting my legs. "Open it," she commanded. Her voice was sharp, steady, and sliced right through the humming sound of the tires on the pavement. I stared down at the worn brown edges of the cardboard envelope. My fingers were trembling so violently I could barely grasp the metal clasp. I knew with every single fiber of my being that whatever was waiting inside that folder was going to completely obliterate the last remaining illusions of my 18-year marriage. I took a deep breath, fighting the nausea rising in my throat, and slid the heavy stack of documents out into the open. The very first thing sitting on top of the stack was a large, glossy photograph. It was a perfectly framed, high-resolution picture taken at a bright, sunny outdoor birthday party. The background was filled with expensive balloon arches, an extravagant 3-tier cake, and a perfectly manicured green lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Right in the dead center of the frame stood my husband, Richard. He was wearing his favorite light blue linen button-down shirt, the exact same shirt I had painstakingly picked out and bought for his 50th birthday celebration just 2 years ago. He was smiling. It was a massive, genuine, radiant smile that reached all the way up to the crinkles around his eyes. It was the exact kind of carefree, loving smile he had not bothered to give me in over a decade. But he was not standing there alone. He had his left arm wrapped possessively around the narrow waist of a remarkably beautiful, much younger blonde woman wearing a floral silk summer dress. In his right arm, he was securely holding a toddler. A little boy, maybe 2 years old, with Richard, exact same straight nose and thick curly brown hair. The little boy was leaning forward, blowing out a single candle. I stopped breathing completely. The edges of my peripheral vision started turning black. I quickly shoved that picture to the back of the stack, praying the next document would somehow prove the first one was a sick, digitally altered joke. But the second paper was another photograph. This one, an aerial real estate shot of a massive, sprawling, colonial-style mansion. It had a sweeping gravel driveway, a 3-car garage, and a large swimming pool glistening in the backyard. The property address and the deed records were printed clearly on the attached page. It was located in a highly exclusive, heavily guarded gated community in suburban Connecticut. The property was listed under an anonymous limited liability company, but the primary contact signature at the bottom of the deed belonged entirely to Richard. My brain started misfiring wildly, rapidly, pulling up years of carefully constructed memories and violently overlapping them with the undeniable evidence sitting on my lap. Connecticut. Richard traveled to Connecticut almost every single month. For years, he told me he was expanding his wealth management firm and meeting with vital, high-net-worth clients on the East Coast. He used to come home exhausted, complaining bitterly about the grueling travel schedules, the terrible airport food, and the endless, boring board meetings. I used to feel incredibly sorry for him. I used to pack his luxury suitcases for him, meticulously folding his ties and slipping little handwritten love notes into his leather toiletry bag, telling him how proud I was of his dedication to our family. A wave of physical disgust washed over me. Then came the terrifying financial flashbacks. 3 years ago, he sat me down at our kitchen table, holding my hands, and convinced me to liquidate a massive portion of my independent retirement fund. He told me the national market was on the verge of a catastrophic crash. He swore he had secured a privately managed, completely recession-proof investment vehicle exclusively for our family. He looked right into my eyes and said he was merely protecting my future, ensuring we would be safe no matter what happened to the economy. Because I loved him, and because he was the recognized financial expert in our home, I watched him transfer hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my personal name without batting an eye. Now staring at the property records and the birthday party, I was looking at exactly where every single penny of my hard-earned money had gone. I had personally funded his secret life. My flower shop profits had paid for the bricks of that Connecticut mansion. My retirement savings had paid for that blonde woman's silk dress and that child-extravagant birthday cake. "Who is she?" I whispered. My voice cracked so badly it sounded like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. The woman driving the car did not even glance over at the photographs. She kept both hands firmly gripped on the steering wheel. "Her name is Ashley," she replied, her tone dripping with a cold, calculated disdain. "She is 28 years old. She thinks she is his one and only legally wedded wife. She thinks he travels to New Mexico and Arizona purely for corporate business. She is living in a beautiful, expensive bubble paid for by your stolen money. But she is not the first woman he lied to, Caroline. And unfortunately for you, you are not the first one either." I finally turned my head to look directly at her profile. "Who are you?" I asked, my heart pounding painfully against my ribs. "My name is Rebecca," she said softly. "I was his very first wife. Long before he ever walked into your flower shop 18 years ago, he was married to me." I stared at her in absolute shock. Richard had always aggressively maintained that I was his first and only true love. He claimed he had spent his entire 20s and early 30s completely focused on his financial education and building his corporate career. He swore to my parents on our wedding day that he had never even had a serious long-term girlfriend before he met me. It was all a meticulously crafted, flawlessly executed lie designed to make me feel uniquely special and entirely secure. Rebecca let out a bitter, hollow laugh that sent a chill straight down my spine. "We were married for 7 long years." She continued, finally glancing at me for a split second before looking back at the road. "We had 2 beautiful, brilliant little girls together. He started out exactly the same way with me as he did with you. He was incredibly charming, overly attentive, the absolute picture-perfect provider. He slowly and methodically took over every single aspect of our household finances. He told me it was just easier that way. He told me he wanted to take the heavy administrative burden off my shoulders so I could focus on raising our daughters. And like an idiot, I handed him the keys to my kingdom. But when he eventually decided he was bored of me, when he decided he wanted to trade me in for a newer model with a fresh bank account, he did not just file for a standard divorce. That would mean legally splitting our assets in court. That would mean paying a massive amount of alimony and monthly child support. And as you are quickly learning, Richard absolutely does not like to share his money. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles popped audibly in the quiet cabin. "He started systematically gaslighting me," she said, her voice dropping into an incredibly low, dangerous register. "He would move my car keys, hide my jewelry, delete important appointments from my calendar, and then look me dead in the eye and tell me I was losing my mind. He changed the passwords to my own personal bank accounts and told me I must have forgotten them due to early onset dementia. When I started demanding answers about the missing money from our savings, his tactics escalated drastically. He began secretly lacing my morning coffee with heavy, unprescribed anxiety medication. I spent months feeling constantly dizzy, paranoid, lethargic, and completely hysterical. When I finally reached my breaking point and started screaming at him in the middle of our driveway in front of all our wealthy neighbors, it gave him exactly the public spectacle he needed. Rebecca took a deep, shaky breath. He had his younger brother Daniel, that slick real estate lawyer you call your brother-in-law, draft up an emergency medical order. They marched into a judge chamber and had me involuntarily committed to a state psychiatric facility. They declared me a severe violent danger to myself and my children due to extreme schizophrenia. By the time I managed to get a blood test, prove I was perfectly sane, and fight my way out of that hospital, it was far too late. I had used my forced institutionalization to gain full, undisputed legal custody of my girls. He legally drained every single account we shared, filed for a divorce that I was legally not mentally competent to contest at the time, and completely disappeared from the state. When I finally hired a private investigator and tracked him down to confront him, he drove me out to this exact stretch of highway. He unlocked the passenger door, shoved me out into the dirt, and told me if I ever came anywhere near him or my daughters again, he and Daniel would make sure I spent the rest of my natural life locked inside a padded cell. I sat there in the passenger seat in absolute deafening silence, fully absorbing the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the evil I had married. Richard was not just a cheating husband having a midlife crisis. He was not just a greedy, unethical financial advisor cutting corners. He was a highly intelligent, predatory monster. He was a calculated, methodical machine who built his immense wealth by entirely consuming the women who loved him, systematically destroying our lives and discarding our empty remains when there was absolutely nothing left to extract. He had financially and emotionally destroyed Rebecca to build his initial foundation. He had completely drained my accounts and my youth to build his brand new life with Ashley in Connecticut. And now he was actively planning to erase my existence, completely leaving me to die of exposure in the desert, just so he could collect the final payout and enjoy his stolen millions in total peace. I looked back down at the glossy photograph of his happy, fake little family. A profound, fundamental, and permanent shift occurred deep inside my chest. The terrified, dependent, abandoned housewife who had been weeping helplessly on the side of the highway completely evaporated into the cool air of that truck. The suffocating panic instantly vanished. The tears dried up on my face, leaving my skin feeling tight, hot, and completely foreign. My rapid heartbeat slowed down, settling into an incredibly heavy, steady, rhythmic thud that felt like a war drum echoing in my ears. I was absolutely no longer a victim. A victim sits in the dirt, cries, and asks the universe why this terrible tragedy is happening to them. A victim begs for mercy from their abuser. I was entirely done begging. The crushing sadness I felt 10 minutes ago was completely incinerated by a cold, calculating, deeply rooted rage. If Richard wanted to play a high-stakes game of survival, he had just made the single biggest, most fatal mistake of his entire miserable life by leaving me breathing. I did not want to just survive this ordeal anymore. I wanted to hunt him down. I wanted to dismantle his entire flawless reputation and his financial empire brick by brick. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating terror I felt standing alone in that desert, only 1,000 times worse. I turned to face Rebecca squarely. My posture straightened. My voice was incredibly steady, cold, and entirely unrecognizable even to my own ears. "Give me your cell phone," I demanded. She did not hesitate for a single second. She reached into the center console, unlocked the screen, and handed me her phone without speaking a single word. She knew exactly what was happening in my head because she had lived it herself. We were now speaking a silent, shared language of pure, unadulterated vengeance. I quickly opened the keypad and dialed the primary VIP customer service number for the massive national bank that held all of our joint accounts. It was the central financial hub for our primary checking, our high-yield savings, and the liquid investment accounts I supposedly shared equally with him. I knew that if I could manage to instantly freeze the main credit lines and lock down the primary checking account, I could at least cut off his immediate day-to-day cash flow. I needed to cause a massive disruption in his daily operations. I needed to throw a massive wrench into his smooth, confident getaway plan before he realized I was still alive. The automated banking system picked up immediately, prompting me to enter my full social security number and my personal verification PIN. I typed the digits in rapidly, praying he had not already changed my access codes. The system paused processing the information with a series of digital clicks before smoothly transferring me out of the automated loop and connecting me directly to a live human representative in the fraud department. "Thank you for calling our premier wealth management services." A very cheerful, highly professional female voice answered through the speaker. "Am I speaking with Caroline?" "Yes, you are," I replied, forcing my breathing to remain perfectly even, keeping my tone entirely conversational, authoritative, and calm. "I need to report a severely compromised situation. I need to place an immediate hard security freeze on every single joint account associated with my social security number. There has been massive fraudulent activity reported, and I need all outgoing transfers halted right this second." "Of course, ma'am. I can absolutely help you secure your assets today," the operator said, her voice dripping with practiced customer service reassurance. "Please give me just one brief moment while I pull up your complete financial portfolio on my screen." I sat in silence, listening intently to the rapid clicking sound of her computer keyboard echoing through the receiver. I looked out the passenger window. The endless red desert was finally giving way to the sprawling paved outskirts of a small town. We were getting much closer to civilization. I was getting much closer to a computer, a police station, and an absolute war. "Ma'am," the operator voice finally returned to the line. Her cheerful, overly polite tone had completely vanished, replaced by a tight, highly professional confusion. "I am looking at your primary profile right now. I am very sorry, but I physically cannot place a security freeze on any of these balances for you today." "What exactly do you mean you cannot freeze them?" I demanded, my voice sharpening into a blade, abandoning all pretense of politeness. "I am the primary joint account holder on those funds. It is my absolute verified legal right to freeze the capital if I suspect fraud. There was a very heavy, agonizingly long pause on the other end of the line. The clicking of the keyboard completely stopped. "I apologize for the immense confusion," Caroline the operator said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But according to our legal department records, you are no longer listed as an authorized signer on any of these balances." As of 8 o'clock. This exact morning, the entire portfolio totaling $1.2 million was legally and permanently transferred out of all joint accounts. The funds were relocated entirely into a private, irrevocable trust. You do not have the legal authority to access, view, or alter any information regarding that specific trust. From our system's perspective, Caroline, your account balance is currently zero. I held the heavy cell phone in my trembling hands, staring blankly at the glowing screen. The devastating revelation that my entire financial existence had been completely wiped out by 9 o'clock this morning was vibrating deep inside my bones. I felt an incredibly desperate, frantic need to involve the authorities immediately. I started dialing the police on the keypad. I wanted heavily armed officers with badges to kick down the glass doors of that bank. I wanted them to drag Richard out of whatever luxury hotel he was hiding in and throw him into the back of a squad car. But right before my thumb could press the final digit to call emergency services, Rebecca reached over the center console and forcefully ripped the device straight out of my grip. "What are you doing?" I screamed at her, my voice cracking violently under the immense crushing pressure of the betrayal. "I have to call the cops right now. He stole absolutely everything from me. He left me to die in the middle of a desert. It is attempted murder." Rebecca slammed her foot on the brakes, pulling the heavy sport utility vehicle sharply into an abandoned, dusty gas station parking lot. She threw the gear shift into park and turned to face me with a look of pure, unforgiving steel. "Listen to me very carefully, Caroline," she said, her tone razor-sharp and completely devoid of panic. "If you call the police right now without a single shred of physical evidence, you are going to walk directly into the exact same psychological trap he built for me 15 years ago." I stared at her, my chest heaving, struggling to process her harsh words through the fog of my own trauma. "Think about it rationally," she continued, leaning closer to me. "You are a 52-year-old woman standing in the middle of nowhere, covered in red dirt, rambling wildly about massive financial conspiracies, secret families, and a husband who magically disappeared on the highway. Richard is a highly respected corporate wealth advisor with pristine community standing. He plays golf with the local chief of police every single Sunday. He donates heavily to the local precinct charity funds. If the authorities call him right now, he will sound incredibly devastated on the phone. He will tell them you have been under immense psychological stress lately. He will say you wandered off during a rest stop while he was in the bathroom checking the tires. He will softly and reluctantly mention to the dispatcher that you have been displaying severe erratic signs of early-onset menopausal paranoia. The horrific, twisted reality of her logic washed over me like a massive bucket of ice water. My breathing stopped entirely. "And who do you honestly think the police are going to believe?" she asked softly, her eyes scanning my dirty face. The hysterical, sun-baked woman screaming about millions of stolen dollars, or the calm, concerned, wealthy husband holding your fabricated medical records? The records his brother Daniel probably already falsified to show you have a documented history of severe mental instability. They will not put Richard in handcuffs, Caroline. They will put you in a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold for your own physical protection. You will be locked in a sterile white room, heavily medicated against your will, while he smoothly finishes draining the remaining assets and finalizes his escape. We absolutely cannot fight a monster like him with panic and tears. We need absolute, undeniable financial proof. We need certified legal documents he cannot simply charm his way out of. I closed my eyes, taking an incredibly deep, rattling breath. The fiery, blinding rage burning inside my chest slowly crystallized into something incredibly cold, hard, and dangerous. She was absolutely right. Screaming for help right now would only make me look like a dangerous lunatic. I needed to infiltrate his criminal operation from the inside out. I needed to physically find the exact paper trail that connected the stolen retirement funds, the secret irrevocable trust, and that massive Connecticut mansion. And there was only one place in this entire state I knew those critical documents had to exist. "I need to borrow your car," I said, opening my eyes and looking directly into her dark eyes. "I need to go see Daniel." Rebecca raised a single skeptical eyebrow, studying my face closely. "Daniel is the primary architect of his legal protection," she warned, her voice low. "He is a vicious corporate shark in a tailored silk suit. If he realizes for even a single second that you know the truth about the money or the other woman, he will alert Richard instantly, and they will accelerate whatever final plan they have for you. He will not realize a single thing I promised, my voice entirely devoid of any recognizable emotion. Richard currently thinks I am either dead from heat stroke or wandering aimlessly in the barren desert. Daniel probably expects a phone call from the highway patrol any minute asking him to come down to the morgue and officially identify my body. I am going to give him exactly what he expects from a helpless, dependent housewife. I am going to play the terrified, confused, broken victim who miraculously survived a terrible accident. He is the trusted family lawyer. He is the supportive, caring brother-in-law. I will run to his massive house for safety, and while he is busy playing the hero, I will find out exactly how they rigged the legal system against me. Rebecca stared at me for a long, heavy moment before a slow, approving smile spread across her face. She recognized the hunter waking up inside me. She reached into the center console, handed me the heavy metal keys, and stepped out of the vehicle without another word. We swapped seats in the dusty parking lot. She told me she would catch a local bus back to her cheap motel and wait patiently for my next signal. As I pulled the heavy, battered Ford out of the parking lot and headed back toward the wealthy northern suburbs, my mind went completely blank. I did not cry anymore. I did not panic about the future. I focused entirely on the long paved road ahead, mentally rehearsing the absolute greatest theatrical performance of my entire life. I drove for 2 solid hours, watching the landscape outside the window shift dramatically from barren red desert brush to lush green manicured lawns, towering oak trees, and sprawling gated estates. Daniel lived in a private residential community that was so incredibly exclusive. The armed security guards knew every single wealthy resident by their first name. Because I was driving a battered, unrecognizable vehicle, I parked the old dusty truck a few blocks away, hiding it carefully behind a tall, thick row of privacy hedges near a public park. I walked the rest of the way to his street, deliberately letting my physical appearance completely deteriorate. I dragged my feet heavily through the decorative white gravel lining the sidewalks. I let my hair remain a tangled, sweaty, disgusting mess. I deliberately ripped the delicate hem of my linen cardigan and smudged dry red dirt aggressively across my cheek and forehead. By the time I finally reached his massive custom mahogany front door, I looked exactly like a tragic, helpless woman who had just barely crawled out of a shallow grave. I pressed the glowing brass doorbell and waited on the massive stone porch. My heart was completely steady. I felt absolutely no fear, just a terrifying, crystal-clear focus. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly and the massive door swung open. Daniel stood there holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch, wearing dark silk loungewear. He was 4 years younger than Richard, but they shared the exact same sharp, predatory eyes and arrogant jawline. When those dark eyes landed on my dirty face, his entire muscular body went completely rigid. The healthy color instantly drained from his perfectly tanned face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The crystal glass in his hand tipped slightly, spilling a few drops of amber liquid directly onto his pristine, imported marble floor. I was incredibly shocked. He was absolutely horrified to see me standing there breathing. But because he was a master legal manipulator and a seasoned liar, he recovered his composure in less than 3 seconds. "Caroline," he gasped loudly, slamming his expensive glass onto a small wooden side table and rushing forward to grab my narrow shoulders. "Oh my God, Caroline, what happened to you? Where have you been all day?" Richard and I have been entirely out of our minds with worry. I immediately collapsed violently into his broad chest, letting out a piercing, hysterical sob that echoed down the quiet suburban street. I let all my physical weight drop, completely forcing him to brace his legs and hold me up. I clung desperately to his expensive silk shirt, crying violently and burying my dirty, sweaty face directly into his shoulder. "Daniel," I wailed loudly, making my voice sound incredibly weak and completely fractured. It was awful. It was so incredibly awful. We pulled over on the highway to check a tire and someone came out of nowhere. They hit me hard. They took my purse and my phone. I fell down a steep hill and hit my head on a rock. I walked for hours and hours, Daniel. I do not even know where Richard is right now. Did they take him? Is my husband okay? I felt his chest expand as he took a deep, stabilizing breath, clearly relieved by my fabricated story. He wrapped his arms around me, patting my back with feigned brotherly affection. "Shh, you are completely safe now," he whispered, playing the role of the protective family member perfectly. "You are completely safe here, Caroline. I am right here. Let us get you inside out of the heat." He practically carried me into his lavish living room, guiding me gently to a massive white leather sectional sofa. I sank deep into the soft cushions, curling my knees tightly to my chest, continuing to tremble and weep uncontrollably. I watched his reflection carefully in the large decorative wall mirror through the tangled strands of my dirty hair. I was pacing the floor, running a hand nervously over his face, clearly trying to rapidly calculate how my unexpected survival impacted their grand financial scheme. "I will call the police!" I sobbed loudly, reaching out a shaking hand toward him. "We have to find Richard right now. They might have killed him for his watch." "No," Daniel said sharply, spinning around to face me. He quickly softened his tone, forcing a warm, reassuring smile onto his face. "I mean, not right this exact second, Caroline. You are in severe medical shock. You are highly dehydrated and very confused. Let me go get you a large glass of ice water and brew some fresh chamomile tea to calm your shattered nerves. Then we will sit down together and call the local authorities. I will handle absolutely everything with the police. You just rest right here." He absolutely did not want me talking to the cops yet. He needed precious time to text Richard. He needed time to warn his brother that the dead woman they planned to bury in the desert had just walked straight into his living room asking for help. "Oh, thank you, Daniel," I whispered, letting my head fall back heavily against the white sofa, closing my eyes as if I was completely exhausted. "You are always so incredibly good to us. I really do not know what I would do without you." He gave me one last patronizing look of fake sympathy before turning on his heel and hurrying quickly down the long hallway toward the expansive modern kitchen. The absolute moment I heard the distant kitchen faucet turn on running water into a kettle, I opened my eyes. The helpless, pathetic demeanor instantly vanished from my body. I stood up from the sofa, moving entirely silently across the thick, expensive Persian rug. Daniel Home Office was located just off the main living area. The heavy double mahogany doors were slightly ajar. I slipped inside holding my breath. The dark room smelled heavily of expensive leather and arrogant corporate entitlement. His massive cherry wood desk was completely cluttered with thick yellow legal pads, glowing computer monitors, and tall stacks of pristine legal documents. I knew I only had a few short minutes before the water boiled. I began rapidly but very carefully scanning the paperwork spread across his desk. I ignored the standard corporate real estate contracts and focused entirely on anything bearing my name or Richard's name. My eyes darted rapidly across a pile of bank statements until they landed squarely on a freshly printed fax sitting directly on top of his black leather portfolio. The official header on the fax was from the county recorder office. I gently pulled the paper closer to the desk lamp. It was a formal property transfer deed. My heart slammed violently against my ribs as I read the thick, bold print. It was the official legal transfer of the massive suburban home Richard and I had lived in for the past 15 years. The beautiful house I had spent countless hours decorating. The house I thought was our permanent safe sanctuary. According to this legal document, the property was being sold today for a total of $1 single to a newly formed limited liability company based completely out of Delaware. I scanned down to the authorized signatures at the very bottom of the page. There was Richard, perfectly looped handwriting, eagerly signing away his half of our shared asset. And right below his name in dark blue ink was my own signature. I leaned much closer, staring hard at the blue ink. It was an absolutely flawless, masterful forgery. The curves, the spacing, the slight elegant slant of the letters. It looked exactly like my handwriting, but I had absolutely never seen this piece of paper in my entire life. I looked at the official notary stamp pressed firmly right beside the signatures. It belonged entirely to Daniel. He had officially notarized a completely forged document, legally verifying under penalty of perjury that I was physically present and of sound mind when I supposedly signed away my own home. The profound betrayal was so massive it made my vision blur. Daniel was not just a passive observer who gave Richard bad legal advice over drinks. He was the active, brilliant architect of my complete destruction. He had systematically built the complicated legal maze that trapped all my hard-earned assets. He was the one who created the anonymous shell companies, the irrevocable trusts, and the fraudulent property transfers. I was actively helping his brother liquidate my entire life so they could split the massive profits. This fax proved beyond any doubt that they were not simply waiting for a nasty divorce. They were actively executing a calculated plan to leave me with absolutely nothing. A sudden, terrifying thought crossed my mind, freezing the blood in my veins. If this specific document was being processed today, it meant they were drastically accelerating their timeline. They did not just want me broke and homeless. The massive life insurance policy I had accidentally discovered in Richard's safe last year flashed vividly into my memory. $3 million payable directly to Richard upon my accidental or unexpected death. That was exactly why they needed me to disappear in the remote desert today. The financial drain was finally complete, and now they were eagerly moving on to the final lucrative payout. I heard the distinct sharp whistle of the tea kettle erupting from the kitchen down the hall. I quickly memorized the exact name of the Delaware shell company, silently placed the forged fax back on the black leather portfolio in the exact same position I found it, and backed out of the office. I moved like a silent ghost across the living room, returning quickly to the white leather sofa. I curled my legs back under me, throwing my dirty hands over my face, and began rocking back and forth slowly. I forced the terrifying reality of their murderous conspiracy down into the absolute darkest corner of my mind. I locked away the boiling rage, locking away the overwhelming violent desire to march into that kitchen and confront him. I had to maintain the strategic silence. If I confronted Daniel right now, he would simply deny it, destroy the documents, and claim my severe head injury was making me hallucinate wild conspiracies. I needed to let them confidently believe their flawless master plan was still perfectly intact. A few moments later, Daniel emerged from the hallway carrying a heavy silver tray with a steaming mug of tea and a tall glass of ice water. His face was a perfect mask of gentle concern, but I could easily see the slight nervous tremor in his hands as he set the tray down on the glass coffee table. "Here you go, Caroline," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the sofa beside me. "Drink this slowly. It will help settle your nerves." I peeked out from behind my dirty hands, letting out a pathetic little whimper. I reached for the warm mug, my hands deliberately shaking so badly that the hot liquid splashed over the rim and slightly burned my fingers. I cried out in fake pain, and Daniel quickly took the mug back, placing it safely on the table. "I am so sorry," I sobbed, leaning away from him, wrapping my arms tightly around my waist. "I am just so scared, Daniel. Everything is a terrible blur. The heat, the walking, the confusion. I do not even remember how I got back to town today. Someone gave me a ride, I think. I just want my husband. Why has Richard not called you yet? Do you think whoever robbed me took him hostage?" Daniel reached out and awkwardly patted my dirty knee. His dark eyes were cold and calculating, taking in my messy hair, my ruined clothes, and my completely submissive posture. He bought the pathetic act entirely. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. A broken, confused, middle-aged woman who was completely dependent on the strong men in her life to solve her complex problems. "Do not worry about Richard," he said smoothly, a faint hint of arrogance bleeding clearly through his fake sympathy. "He is a very smart survivor. I am completely sure he is just as frantic trying to find you right now. In fact, I just sent him a quick emergency message while the water was boiling. I am sure he will be here very soon to take you home." I looked up at him, my eyes wide and swimming with perfectly manufactured tears. "Home," I whispered, letting the word hang heavily in the air. "Yes, I just want to go back to our beautiful safe home." Daniel smiled down at me. It was a chilling, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, Caroline," he murmured softly. "We will get you home. Everything is going to be perfectly fine. You just rest now. Let the men handle the complicated stuff." I nodded slowly, resting my head against the soft back of the sofa, closing my eyes again. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool, air-conditioned air. "Let the men handle the complicated stuff." Those arrogant words echoed loudly in my mind, permanently sealing his fate. He honestly thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought he and his brother had successfully erased my entire future with forged signatures and invisible shell companies. But as I sat there in the luxurious home of my worst enemy, sipping the tea he made for me, the hunter inside me quietly sharpened her knives. They had stolen my money. They were trying to steal my home. But they made the fatal, catastrophic mistake of leaving me my mind. And I was going to use it to burn their entire criminal empire to the ground. The air in that cramped motel room felt thick with a strange mix of dread and electric anticipation. Rebecca and I sat across from each other at a scratched wooden table, a map of my own home sketched out on a cheap notepad between us. It was a surreal nightmare. I was plotting a break-in for a house that had my name on the mortgage. Richard thought the desert had already claimed me. He was probably sitting in his leather recliner right now, sipping a glass of expensive scotch, toasting to his new life as a wealthy, unburdened widower. He thought I was just another tragic headline waiting to be discovered. He had no idea the woman he left to die was about to turn his carefully constructed empire into dust. We went over the timeline again and again. Richard had a standing golf game every Thursday afternoon with his arrogant business partners, followed by drinks at the club. That gave us exactly a 3-hour window. 3 hours to turn the tables. 3 hours to gather enough ammunition to blow his life apart. I refused to shed another tear. The scared, confused wife who had been abandoned in the scorching heat was gone. In her place was someone cold, calculated, and ready for war. I was no longer the victim. I was the hunter. The drive back to my neighborhood was pure torture. I slouched low in the passenger seat of Rebecca U.S. old sedan, watching the familiar manicured lawns and towering oak trees roll past the tinted windows. Everything looked so sickeningly normal. Kids were riding their bikes, sprinklers were turning in slow arcs, and yet my entire universe had been violently ripped apart. When Rebecca parked a block away from my house, my heart started hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I took a deep, shaky breath, gripping the door handle. This was it. Slipping through the side gate was easy. The real challenge was keeping my composure as I walked through the backyard I had lovingly designed. I moved silently toward the massive rose bush near the patio, before Richard started making real money, before the lies and the coldness set in. I used to be a florist. I knew plants. I knew the earth. I had insisted on planting these specific crimson roses myself. And beneath a heavy decorative stone at the base of the deeply thorny roots, I had buried a spare key wrapped in waterproof plastic. It was a secret I kept even from him, a habit from my single days living in sketchy apartments. Now that tiny secret was my lifeline. I pushed my hand into the dirt, ignoring the sharp thorns tearing into my skin. The physical pain was nothing compared to the betrayal burning in my chest. My fingers brushed the plastic. I pulled it out, gripping the cold metal key. Slipping it into the back door lock, I held my breath. It turned with a soft, satisfying click. The silence of the house hit me like a physical blow. The air smelled faintly of his heavy sandalwood cologne and fresh bleach. He had the cleaning service come early, probably to scrub away any lingering presence of me. I did not waste time wandering the halls or mourning the memories in the living room. I moved straight for the Tiger Use Den, his home office. The room was locked, but the cheap mechanism on the interior door was no match for a credit card, a trick I learned back in college. Stepping inside, the temperature felt 10 degrees colder. This was his sanctuary, a place I was rarely allowed to enter. I fired up his desktop computer. I knew his password. He was a narcissist who thought he was untouchable, using the name of his first luxury sports car followed by his birth year. Classic Richard. While the machine hummed to life, I plugged in the high-capacity external hard drive Rebecca had bought. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the cable twice. Every creak of the house settling sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like him standing in the doorway. But I forced myself to focus. I initiated a massive file transfer, dragging every folder, every hidden directory, every financial spreadsheet into the drive. The progress bar crawled. It felt like agonizing hours. While the computer copied his digital sins, I turned my attention to the wall safe hidden behind a framed abstract painting. He thought he was so clever, but I had watched him open it once in the reflection of the glass display case across the room. I spun the dial. 3 clicks right, 2 left, 1 right. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside, I found exactly what I needed and exactly what I feared. A thick leather-bound ledger sat on this top shelf. I pulled out my phone and started snapping pictures, page after page, of offshore accounts, shell companies, and massive wire transfers that he had hidden from the IRS and from me. But underneath the ledger was a sleek black folder with a gold-embossed logo. A law firm. I opened it and the blood froze in my veins. It was a life insurance policy. Not a standard one, but a massive, aggressive corporate policy worth $3 million. I was the insured. He was the sole beneficiary. I scanned the dense legal jargon, my eyes catching on a highlighted section near the back. Fast-tracked declaration of death. Clipped to the page was a glossy business card belonging to Daniel, his sleazy lawyer friend. My mind raced, piecing together the horrifying puzzle. The document outlined a specific clause regarding disappearances in high-risk remote environments, like the desert. If I went missing under dangerous circumstances and my body was not found within 48 hours, Daniel had already drafted the preliminary paperwork to petition a judge for an immediate presumption of death. It was a legal loophole designed for extreme tragedies, and Richard was exploiting it for a massive payout. He did not just leave me in the desert because he hated me, or because he wanted a divorce without losing half his assets. He left me there to die so he could cash in on my life. $3 million. That was my worth to the man I had slept next to for 7 years. I stared at the paperwork, the sheer evil of his plan radiating off the page. The 48-hour window was closing fast. If I did not act, he would legally erase me from the world and walk away a multimillionaire. The transfer complete chime from the computer broke through my terrifying realization. I had the evidence. Now I had to destroy him before he destroyed my very existence. The motel room smelled heavily of cheap bleach and stale cigarette smoke. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the glowing screen of Rebecca's laptop. The digital files I had successfully stolen from Richard's home office were actively decoding before our eyes. We had massive offshore wire transfers, hidden ledgers, and that terrifying $3 million life insurance policy sitting right in front of us. It was a mountain of undeniable financial evidence. But as Rebecca and I carefully scrolled through the dense legal jargon, a completely sickening realization began to wash over both of us. The paperwork was absolutely flawless. Daniel was an incredibly vicious lawyer, but he was also a brilliant one. He had layered the shell companies and the offshore accounts through so many complex international loopholes that untangling it in a federal court could easily take 5 to 10 years. Richard and Daniel were highly respected, wealthy, white-collar professionals. If we simply handed these digital files over to a standard police detective, they would immediately hire a team of ruthless defense attorneys. They would drag the investigation out for decades while I remained completely penniless. I would be trapped in an endless legal nightmare fighting a system that inherently protected men with deep pockets. The financial evidence alone was simply not a fast enough poison to kill the beast they had created. We did not just need the authorities to look at a spreadsheet. We needed their entire perfectly constructed criminal operation to violently implode from the inside out. Rebecca closed the laptop with a soft click and looked at me across the dimly lit room. "You cannot just lock the front door to a fortress," she said quietly. "You have to convince the guards inside to burn it down for you." She was exactly right. Richard and Daniel had built their massive wealth entirely on a foundation of mutual greed. They were loyal to each other only because the money was currently flowing smoothly. If that money was suddenly threatened by internal paranoia, their brotherhood would instantly shatter. And there was only one person in this entire twisted equation who possessed enough arrogant entitlement to demand answers and cause a catastrophic disruption. The young blonde woman living in a stolen mansion 3,000 miles away, Ashley. We needed to change our primary target. We needed to fly to suburban Connecticut and introduce a highly contagious virus into their happy little home. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I had completely transformed my physical appearance. The terrified, dusty woman from the desert was entirely gone. Rebecca used a portion of her emergency cash savings to buy me a conservative navy blue blazer, a crisp white button-down blouse, and a modest knee-length skirt from a local department store. I pulled my tangled hair back into a tight, severe bun and wore a pair of simple wire-rimmed reading glasses. I looked exactly like a highly organized, deeply pious church administrator. I looked like a woman who carried a clipboard and asked uncomfortable questions about tax-deductible charity donations. The cross-country flight to Connecticut gave me plenty of time to meticulously rehearse my fabricated identity. I was going to be a senior inventory clerk for the Regional Church Council Charity Committee. Richard was a very public donor to our local congregation back home, and he heavily used his religious standing to project an image of absolute moral perfection to his wealthy clients. It was the perfect, completely believable excuse for a church representative to show up unannounced at his East Coast property to verify his upcoming philanthropic pledges. When my rental car finally pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of the exclusive suburban community, my stomach tightened into a hard knot. The neighborhood was sickeningly opulent. Towering ancient trees lined the perfectly paved streets, and every single house looked like a sprawling medieval estate. When I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the address listed on the property deed, I actually had to stop the car and catch my breath. The photographs had not done the sheer scale of the theft any justice. The house was a massive 3-story colonial mansion with pristine white pillars and a heavily manicured green lawn that stretched out endlessly. My flower shop profits, my retirement savings, my 18 years of absolute devotion. It was all proudly displayed in the imported brickwork of a house I was never meant to see. I stepped out of the car, gripping my faux leather clipboard tightly against my chest. I marched up the wide stone steps and pressed the glowing doorbell. A few agonizing moments later, the heavy wooden door swung open. Standing in the grand foyer was the exact same beautiful blonde woman from the birthday party photograph, Ashley. She was wearing expensive silk loungewear and holding a tiny purebred dog in one arm. Up close, she looked even younger than 28. She had flawlessly clear skin, bright blue eyes, and an overwhelming aura of absolute spoiled entitlement. She looked me up and down with immediate sharp suspicion, taking in my conservative, modest clothing. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with a cold, impatient condescension. I adjusted my glasses and offered her a warm, professional smile. "Good morning," I said, keeping my tone incredibly polite and slightly deferential. "My name is Caroline. I am a senior inventory clerk acting on behalf of the Regional Church Council Charity Committee. I am looking for the primary residence of Mr. Richard. He generously pledged a substantial endowment to our upcoming global outreach program, and our committee requires a standard physical verification of all major donor residential assets for our final tax compliance forms." The mention of Richard's name and a massive charity donation instantly softened her rigid posture. Her arrogant suspicion was quickly replaced by a smug, glowing pride. She clearly loved the idea that her partner was a recognized, wealthy philanthropist. It validated her luxurious lifestyle. "Oh, of course," she said, opening the door wider and stepping aside to let me enter. "Please come inside." Richard is currently traveling on business out west, but I handle all the household administration when he is away. I can certainly help you with whatever paperwork you need. I stepped into the grand foyer and my breath caught in my throat. The interior was even more extravagant than the exterior. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling. Expensive modern art lined the freshly painted walls. Every single piece of furniture looked like it cost more than I used to make in an entire year at the flower shop. I forced myself to maintain a neutral professional expression while my heart screamed in absolute pure rage. "You have a truly beautiful home," I murmured, following her into a massive gourmet kitchen that featured sprawling white marble countertops and custom cabinetry. "You and Mr. Richard must be incredibly happy here. Have you been married long?" I dropped the question entirely casually, while pretending to carefully review the blank papers on my clipboard. I watched her reaction perfectly in the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator. Her shoulders tensed immediately. The smug pride vanished, completely replaced by a sharp, bitter annoyance. "We are not legally married yet," she corrected sharply, setting her tiny dog down on the pristine floor. She walked over to the espresso machine and began aggressively pushing buttons. "We are fully committed to each other, of course. We have a beautiful son together. But we are currently waiting for some very complicated legal matters to clear up before we can finalize our formal wedding plans." I looked up from my clipboard, feigning mild, polite confusion. "Oh, I apologize," I said softly. "I simply assumed from the substantial size of the pledged charity endowment that all his primary financial assets were completely settled. The Church Council usually avoids soliciting donations from estates that are currently tied up in probate or active litigation." Ashley let out a harsh, bitter laugh, turning to face me with a dark scowl. "Tell me about it," she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "It is an absolute nightmare. Richard is trying his best to protect our family wealth, but his crazy ex-wife is completely out of her mind. She is a deeply unstable, paranoid woman who refuses to simply sign the divorce papers and move on with her pathetic life. She is maliciously dragging him through the mud, tying up all his primary liquid assets in a vicious court battle just to spite him. He tells me every single day that as soon as the judge finally throws her baseless claims out, we are going to have a massive destination wedding in Italy." The sheer audacity of the lie literally took my breath away. Richard had painted me as a crazy, greedy ex-wife holding his money hostage. I was using the exact same psychological playbook on Ashley that he had successfully used against Rebecca 15 years ago. He was feeding this gullible, greedy girl a steady diet of corporate fairy tales to keep her compliant while he lived a complete double life. She honestly believed that once I was finally removed from the picture, she would instantly become the sole legal queen of his massive financial empire. "That sounds incredibly stressful for you," I said, pouring a thick layer of fake sympathy into my voice. "It is truly a shame when a former spouse allows their bitter jealousy to threaten the financial security of an innocent child. I certainly hope Mr. Richard has taken the proper legal precautions to secure your future in the meantime." "Oh, he absolutely has," Ashley replied, her arrogant confidence quickly returning. "Richard is a brilliant wealth advisor. He told me he specifically moved all our major liquid capital into a highly secure private trust fund. He promised me that no matter what that crazy woman tries to pull in court, my son and I are completely untouchable. We own everything." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression entirely blank. While a cold, triumphant smile spread across my soul, she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed. She believed she was the primary beneficiary of his grand financial scheme. She believed the stolen millions were waiting entirely for her. It was time to completely shatter her delusion and let the internal poison do its work. I began pulling a thick stack of printed documents out of my leather briefcase, spreading them carefully across her massive marble kitchen island. "I need to verify a few basic property tax routing numbers for the church records," I explained smoothly. "Would you happen to have a glass of water I could trouble you for? I have been visiting donor homes all morning and my throat is terribly dry." "Of course," she said, turning her back to me and walking toward the far end of the sprawling kitchen to fetch a crystal glass from the upper cabinets. The absolute second she looked away, I moved with lightning speed. I slipped my hand into the hidden compartment of my briefcase and pulled out a single, freshly printed piece of paper. It was a direct copy of the irrevocable trust ledger I had stolen from Richard's secure computer files yesterday. It was the exact document showing where the $1.2 million from my retirement accounts had been legally transferred. I took a bright yellow highlighter from my pocket and quickly swiped it across one specific devastating line of text near the bottom of the page. I placed the highlighted document directly on top of my neat stack of church paperwork, leaving it completely exposed on the white marble island. Ashley walked back over and handed me the heavy crystal glass of ice water. "Thank you so much," I said, taking a slow, deliberate sip. I began gathering up my fake church forms, leaving the highlighted trust document sitting perfectly in the center of the island. I think I have absolutely everything I need for the preliminary committee report. You have been incredibly helpful today. I turned to walk toward the grand foyer, purposefully leaving the critical piece of paper behind. I knew exactly what would happen next. Ashley was a deeply insecure, greedy woman living in constant fear that a crazy ex-wife might steal her luxurious lifestyle. The moment I left, she would absolutely inspect every single thing I had touched. As I reached the heavy wooden front door, I paused and looked back over my shoulder. Ashley was already standing over the marble island, staring down at the piece of paper I had left behind. I watched her eyes quickly scan the dense legal text. I watched her gaze completely lock onto the bright yellow highlighted section. Her posture went entirely rigid. The crystal glass of water she had poured for herself slipped straight through her perfectly manicured fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, completely destroying the quiet peace of the massive mansion. The highlighted section on that paper was incredibly simple and utterly devastating. It clearly stated that the sole legal trustee and the only individual with total authorized power over the $1.2 million irrevocable trust was not Richard. It was not Ashley. And it was absolutely not her 2-year-old son. The sole legal controller of the entire stolen fortune was Daniel. I quietly pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me, stepping back out into the bright Connecticut sunlight. A cold, satisfied thrill rushed through my veins. The seed of absolute destructive suspicion had been perfectly planted in the highly fertile soil of her greed. By tonight, she would be screaming at Richard, demanding to know why his brother secretly owned their entire life. By tomorrow, the two men would be tearing each other to pieces. The fortress was finally burning. The drive back to the motel was completely silent, but my mind was screaming. I gripped the steering wheel of the rental car tightly, letting the satisfaction of what I had just done settle deep into my bones. I had lit a massive fire in Connecticut, and now it was time to watch those flames spread all the way back to the desert. When I finally walked into our cheap motel room, Rebecca was already sitting at the small wooden table. She had a pair of heavy black headphones resting around her neck and a small digital audio receiver plugged directly into her laptop. During my terrifying break-in at our house the day before, I did not just steal files from his computer. Taking a page right out of a psychological thriller, I had reached beneath the heavy mahogany wood of his desk and stuck a tiny voice-activated recording device directly next to the power cables. It was a cheap piece of technology Rebecca had bought online, but right now it was the single most valuable weapon in our entire arsenal. I sat down on the edge of the sagging mattress, exhausted but entirely wired with adrenaline. "Did we get anything yet?" I asked, pouring myself a plastic cup of warm tap water. Rebecca smiled a deeply dark, predatory smile. She unplugged the headphones so the audio would play loudly through the external speakers. "Just listen to this," she said, pressing a button on her keyboard. At first, there was only the sound of static and the faint rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in his home office. Then the heavy wooden door slammed open so violently it actually rattled the tiny microphone. Richard's voice came through the laptop speakers, completely distorted by pure, unadulterated rage. "I do not care what time it is, Daniel, get over here right this second," Richard screamed into his cell phone. Ashley just called me completely hysterical. She said a woman from the regional church council came by to check on a donation and accidentally left a copy of the trust document sitting on the kitchen counter. "She knows your name is on the accounts, Daniel. She knows you control the money." I leaned forward, staring intensely at the laptop screen as if I could physically see them through the plastic. The trap had sprung perfectly. A long 20 minutes of agonizing silence followed, broken only by the sound of Richard pacing furiously back and forth across the hardwood floor. The heavy clinking of ice cubes against crystal echoed through the room as he poured himself drink after drink. Finally, the heavy office door opened again. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel demanded, his voice tight and breathless, as if he had practically sprinted from his luxury car to the front door. "You tell me," Richard snarled. "How did a church clerk get her hands on our private financial records? And why is Ashley currently threatening to pack up my son and move back to her mother's house in Boston? I told you to keep those trust documents buried beneath 6 layers of anonymous shell companies. If she leaves me now, the entire Connecticut setup falls completely apart. It was not a mistake on my end." "Richard," Daniel shot back, his tone highly defensive and sharp. "The legal structure is absolutely flawless. The only way someone got that specific paperwork is if your paranoid little girlfriend went digging through my encrypted emails. I told you she was a massive liability. I told you that putting the trust solely in my name was the only way to legally shield the liquid assets during the impending divorce proceedings. If your name was on it, Caroline lawyers could have frozen the entire portfolio on day one." "Divorce proceedings." Richard laughed bitterly. "There is no divorce, Daniel. Caroline is rotting at the bottom of a ravine out on Interstate 40 right now. I left her with absolutely nothing. She is dead. Which means the assets are entirely safe and there is absolutely no reason for you to still be the sole legal beneficiary of my money. I want those accounts transferred back to my name by tomorrow morning. Daniel let out a low, humorless chuckle that made my skin crawl. It is not that simple, big brother, Daniel said smoothly, his voice dripping with arrogant leverage. You see, when we initially set this up, you agreed to a 20% management fee for my legal services. But circumstances have changed drastically. We are no longer just hiding money from a naive dependent housewife. We are actively covering up a murder. If the highway patrol finds her body before the natural elements destroy the evidence, I am the one who has to legally defend you. I am the one forging the property deeds. I am the one risking federal prison time. So my fee has officially gone up. What are you talking about? Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a highly dangerous whisper. I want 50%, Daniel stated flatly, refusing to back down. I want half of the $1.2 million currently sitting in the trust. And I want exactly half of the $3 million life insurance payout when we file the claim next week. If you do not agree to split the insurance money equally with me, I will simply freeze the trust indefinitely. You will not see a single dime to calm Ashley down. You greedy bastard, Richard hissed, slamming his glass down on the desk. I built this entire empire. I married the woman. I dealt with her boring, pathetic existence for 18 years just to secure that capital. I was the one who looked her right in the eyes and left her in the desert. You just sat in your air-conditioned office and stamped some papers. And those papers are the only thing keeping you out of a lethal injection chamber, Daniel countered fiercely. I filed the preliminary medical report stating she was suffering from a severe nervous breakdown. I laid the entire psychological groundwork. We need to file the official missing persons report in exactly 24 hours to trigger the expedited insurance payout. You need me, Richard. You absolutely cannot pull this off alone. I sat completely frozen on the motel bed, listening to the two wealthy, respected brothers tear each other apart like a pair of starving wolves fighting over a fresh carcass. They were completely devoid of any basic human empathy. They were casually calculating the financial value of my life while standing in the very room where I used to bring Richard his morning coffee. The absolute cruelty of their words should have broken my heart all over again. But instead it acted as a massive dose of pure adrenaline. They had just handed me a golden ticket. They had explicitly confessed to attempted murder, extortion, fraud, and conspiracy on a crystal-clear digital recording. Richard finally let out a heavy, defeated sigh. Fine, he spat venomously. 50%. But you better fast-track that insurance claim the absolute second the police declare her legally missing. I want this entirely finished. Rebecca reached over and stopped the recording. The silence in the motel room was absolutely deafening. We have them, she whispered, her dark eyes shining with a fierce, intense energy. We actually have them, Caroline. But who do we take this to? I asked, my mind racing through the complicated legal hurdles. If we take this to the local police chief, Richard will just bribe him at the golf course, or Daniel will find a highly technical legal loophole to claim the audio is a digitally fabricated fake. We do not take it to the local police? Rebecca said firmly, standing up and grabbing her worn leather purse from the chair. When I was fighting Daniel in family court 15 years ago, I reached out to a massive number of private investigators. Most of them told me I was crazy, but one of them actually listened to my story. He was a junior financial auditor back then. Now he is a senior federal investigator for the FBI specializing in major white-collar fraud. He knows exactly who Daniel is, and he has been waiting a very long time for the perfect excuse to rip his corrupt law firm completely apart. 2 hours later, we were sitting in the back booth of a dimly lit 24-hour diner on the absolute edge of the county line. The man sitting across from us introduced himself as Agent Hayes. He wore a simple gray suit and had deeply tired, observant eyes that immediately commanded respect. He did not ask me how I survived the desert heat. He did not offer any empty, patronizing platitudes about my trauma. He simply took the headphones, plugged them into his secure federal tablet, and listened to the entire 20-minute argument without blinking once. When the audio finally finished, he slowly took off the headphones and looked directly into my eyes. Caroline, this is an incredibly compelling piece of evidence, he said, his voice low and incredibly steady. It clearly establishes intent, malice, and motive. However, because this was recorded illegally inside a private residence without a federal warrant, Daniel defense team will immediately file a motion to have it completely thrown out of court. They will argue it is entirely inadmissible under strict state privacy laws. My heart plummeted straight into my stomach. Are you telling me they are going to get away with this? I demanded, gripping the edge of the sticky diner table so hard my fingers ached. Are you telling me I went through all of this terror for absolutely nothing? Agent Hayes held up a hand to stop me. I said it might get thrown out of a standard court proceeding, he corrected smoothly. I did not say it was useless. This recording gives me the exact probable cause I need to officially open a massive federal wire fraud investigation. But if you want to put them both behind bars for the rest of their natural lives, and guarantee you get every single penny of your money back. We cannot just arrest them for talking privately about a crime. We need to catch them actively committing the crime. We need them to execute the insurance fraud in a highly public, irreversible manner. How do we force them to do that? Rebecca asked, leaning forward over the table. Agent Hayes pulled a small black notepad from his jacket pocket. For the life insurance company to pay out $3 million. Richard has to officially submit a claim of death or a legal presumption of death under false pretenses. He has to do it using the postal service or electronic wire across state lines, which immediately triggers a massive federal jurisdiction. We need him to put on a public performance. We need him to establish a solid public timeline of your disappearance in front of highly reliable witnesses and physically sign the fraudulent documents in real time. If he does that while I have undercover agents in the room, the trap snaps completely shut. No high-priced lawyer in the world can save him from federal fraud charges. I stared down at my cold cup of diner coffee, my mind spinning rapidly. I needed to force Richard to make his final move. I needed to give him a stage so massive and so public that his incredibly arrogant ego could not resist stepping right into the spotlight. We drove back to the motel just as the sun was beginning to rise, casting a dark, blood-red glow over the distant mountains. I opened my laptop and logged into my secure email account. I had completely avoided checking it since the desert terrified that Richard might have tracking software installed. But I needed to know what his official public narrative was right now. I navigated directly to the local community page for our incredibly wealthy conservative church and the exclusive country club we belong to. My heart completely stopped as I read the massive, bold headline plastered across the top of the digital newsletter. A tragic loss for our community. Please join us in praying for the safe return of Caroline. I clicked on the link, my hands shaking violently. It was a formal digital invitation written entirely by Richard. He had spared absolutely no expense on the public theatrics. The invitation featured a beautiful black and white photograph of me from a hospital charity gala 5 years ago. Beneath the picture was a deeply emotional, heart-wrenching paragraph detailing how I had been suffering from a severe, undiagnosed nervous breakdown. He claimed that during a peaceful drive to Arizona to seek specialized medical treatment, I had suddenly become completely disoriented, wandered away from the vehicle at a remote rest stop, and vanished into the unforgiving wilderness. He wrote that professional search and rescue teams had been scouring the area for 3 days with absolutely no success. He was utterly devastated. He was a broken man simply seeking the comforting embrace of his community during his darkest hour. But the final paragraph was the absolute most sickening part of the entire page. He was officially inviting the entire town council, the church elders, his wealthy business partners, and all of our affluent neighbors to a massive formal prayer vigil and charity fundraiser. The event was scheduled for tomorrow evening in the grand ballroom of the local country club. He claimed the fundraiser was designed to gather money for local search and rescue organizations in my honor. "I is not raising money for search teams," I whispered, staring at the screen in absolute total horror. "He is building his permanent alibi." Rebecca read the screen over my shoulder, her jaw set tight. "He is using the vigil to legitimize your death," she said coldly. "If 500 of the most respected people in the county attend a memorial for you and officially offer their condolences, it legally solidifies his fabricated timeline. The insurance company will see the massive public response, the signed police reports, and the community validation. They will completely bypass the standard waiting period and cut him the $3 million check by the end of the week." It was a stroke of absolute criminal genius. He was manipulating the genuine grief and sympathy of an entire town to grease the wheels of his massive financial payout. He was going to stand on a beautifully decorated stage shed, perfect crocodile tears, and formally sign the preliminary insurance claim paperwork with Daniel standing right by his side protecting him. I grabbed my cell phone and immediately dialed Agent Hayes. He answered on the second ring. "I have your public performance," I told him, my voice ringing with a terrifying absolute certainty. "Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. The exclusive country club. He is hosting a massive memorial vigil for me. He is going to use the event to finalize the narrative and process the legal paperwork with the insurance company." Agent Hayes was quiet for a brief calculating moment. "I can have a team of undercover agents positioned inside the ballroom posing as catering staff and wealthy donors," he said. "I can also pull strings to have an undercover federal investigator pose as the senior insurance adjuster assigned to your specific case. If Richard attempts to hand that adjuster a signed fraudulent claim, In front of a room full of witnesses, we have him dead to rights on federal wire fraud, attempted grand larceny, and conspiracy. I'm going to be there too, I said, gripping the phone tightly. Caroline, it is incredibly dangerous to reveal yourself before the trap is completely sprung. Agent Hayes warned, his tone shifting to genuine concern. If he sees you in the crowd, he will abort the insurance claim instantly and try to pivot his story to make you look crazy. He will not see me until it is entirely too late, I promised, staring fiercely at my own reflection in the dark window of the motel room. He wants to throw a lavish party to celebrate my death. He wants to stand on a stage and tell the entire world that I am gone forever. I am going to let him do exactly that. I am going to let him climb all the way to the absolute highest peak of his arrogant victory. And then I am going to walk through the front doors of that ballroom and push him straight off the edge. I hung up the phone and looked at Rebecca. She was smiling. It was the beautiful, dangerous smile of a woman who had waited 15 long years to watch her monster finally burn. We had exactly 24 hours to prepare for the greatest resurrection this town had ever seen. The scared, vulnerable victim he left in the desert was officially dead. The woman walking into that country club tomorrow night was going to be his absolute executioner. The warm evening air outside the exclusive country club was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive imported cigars. I stood perfectly still in the dark shadows of the massive stone courtyard, watching the endless line of luxury vehicles pull up to the valet stand. Valets in crisp white uniforms rushed back and forth, opening doors for the wealthiest and most influential residents of our sprawling suburban town. Women wearing elegant black evening gowns and men in tailored dark suits stepped out of their cars, speaking in hushed, respectful tones. They were all gathering in the grand ballroom tonight to mourn the tragic and sudden disappearance of a beloved community member. They were gathering to mourn me. I looked down at my own clothes. I was still wearing the exact same linen trousers and light summer cardigan I had on when Richard locked the car doors and left me on the side of Interstate 40. The fabric was completely ruined, permanently stained with deep red desert dirt, dried sweat, and the harsh grime of survival. My hair was pulled back into a messy, tangled knot, and my skin still felt tight and burned from the unforgiving New Mexico sun. I looked absolutely terrifying. I looked like a ghost who had crawled directly out of a shallow, sandy grave. And that was exactly the point. Rebecca stood silently right beside me in the shadows, wearing a simple dark dress that helped her blend perfectly into the night. She did not say a single word of encouragement because she knew I did not need it anymore. The terrified, broken housewife who used to eagerly seek validation from her husband was completely dead. The woman standing in the courtyard tonight was an entirely different creature, forged in the absolute darkest fires of betrayal. We were completely ready. We had spent the entire afternoon carefully setting the final pieces of our trap into motion. Using a portion of Rebecca's emergency cash, we had quietly approached a young sound technician hired by the country club for the evening event. We told him a carefully fabricated story about a surprise family tribute video, and paid him a highly generous sum to bypass the main soundboard and wait for my specific physical signal. Before playing the audio file, we handed him on a small silver flash drive. Through the towering glass windows of the grand ballroom, I could clearly see the elaborate setup Richard had orchestrated for his final public performance. He had spared absolutely no expense to secure his flawless alibi. The massive room was heavily decorated with hundreds of pure white lilies. It was a deeply ironic choice considering I had spent 18 years working as a professional florist, and he knew perfectly well that I absolutely despised the smell of white lilies. A massive, professionally printed portrait of me rested on a wooden easel right next to the main stage, surrounded by flickering white candles. The local mayor, the chief of police, several prominent church elders, and all of Richard's wealthy corporate investors were seated at the front tables, nodding in solemn sympathy. And standing near the back of the room, partially hidden behind a towering ice sculpture, was Ashley. She was wearing a completely inappropriate tight black cocktail dress, holding a crystal glass of champagne with a white knuckle grip. She looked incredibly tense and deeply furious. My visit to her Connecticut mansion the day before had clearly worked exactly as intended. She had obviously flown across the country in a blind rage, demanding to know why Daniel controlled her entire financial future. Richard must have desperately convinced her to attend tonight's party, promising her that this event was the final necessary step before they could claim the $3 million insurance policy and finally be free. She was watching him with cold, calculating eyes, completely unaware that she was just another expendable pawn in his massive criminal game. The heavy velvet curtains on the main stage slowly parted, and Richard walked up to the microphone. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd instantly died down. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored Italian suit. He looked incredibly handsome, deeply exhausted, and perfectly devastated. Daniel stood slightly behind him to the left, playing the role of the incredibly supportive, protective younger brother. Richard gripped the edges of the wooden podium, tightly bowing his head for a long, dramatic moment before finally looking up at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight." He began, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom with a masterful, perfectly calibrated tremble. "I cannot begin to express how much your incredible support means to my family during this unimaginable nightmare. As many of you already know, my beautiful wife Caroline has been suffering from a severe and rapidly deteriorating mental health crisis over the past year. We tried everything to keep it entirely private to protect her dignity, but her silent battles eventually overwhelmed her fragile mind. I stood in the darkness outside, listening to the clear audio feeding through the outdoor patio speakers. My blood ran completely cold, but my heart remained perfectly steady. He was doing exactly what we knew he would do. He was actively laying down this permanent psychological groundwork to legally justify his massive insurance claim. He was looking directly into the eyes of our neighbors and lying with the smooth, effortless grace of a true psychopath. During our road trip to a specialized treatment facility out west, she became terribly disoriented. Richard continued pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at the corners of his dry eyes. She wandered away from our vehicle at a remote desert rest stop. The local authorities and federal search teams have spent days scouring the unforgiving wilderness, but the harsh reality of the desert environment is leaving us with very little hope. I am completely shattered. I have lost the absolute love of my life. A collective sympathetic sigh rippled through the grand ballroom. Several women at the front tables reached for their own tissues. Daniel placed a comforting hand on his brother's shoulder, nodding solemnly to the crowd. It was a sickening, brilliant performance. But Caroline was a woman who deeply loved her community. Richard said, his voice growing slightly stronger, taking on a tone of resilient religious faith. She would not want us to simply sit here in despair. She would want us to take this profound tragedy and turn it into something meaningful. That is why Daniel and I have officially filed the necessary legal paperwork this morning to begin the process of establishing the Caroline Memorial Charity Fund. We want to ensure her beautiful legacy lives on to help fund emergency search and rescue operations for other lost souls. That was the absolute final nail in his own coffin. He had just publicly admitted to filing the official legal paperwork related to my disappearance, and he was actively soliciting financial donations across state lines, based entirely on a fabricated death. The federal agents we had positioned inside the room, disguised as catering staff, and wealthy out-of-town investors were recording every single word. He had confidently walked right into the center of the trap and enthusiastically pulled the lever himself. I looked at Rebecca. She gave me a single firm nod. It was time. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly toward the massive, heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom. There were no security guards posted outside because Richard never expected a dead woman to crash her own memorial service. I placed both of my dirty, bruised hands flat against the polished wood and pushed with every single ounce of strength I had left in my body. The heavy doors swung violently inward, hitting the interior walls with a massive, echoing thud that sounded like a gunshot. The absolute silence that fell over the grand ballroom was instantaneous and completely suffocating. The soft classical piano music drifting from the corner abruptly stopped. 500 incredibly wealthy, influential people turned around in their seats, all at exactly the same time. I stood perfectly still, framed entirely in the massive doorway. The bright crystal chandeliers illuminated every single filthy detail of my appearance. They illuminated the thick red dirt caked into my tangled hair, the deep scratches on my arms, and the dark, heavy stains on my ruined clothes. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if time had completely frozen in the lavish room. I stepped across the threshold, my heavy, ruined shoes sinking into the pristine white carpet. Rebecca walked immediately through the doors right behind me, stepping up to my left side and locking her arm firmly through mine. Together we began the incredibly long, slow walk straight down the center aisle toward the main stage. The reactions rippling through the crowd were absolutely intoxicating to watch. The mayor wife covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled, terrified gasp. The church elders stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, completely unable to comprehend the impossible sight of a resurrected woman. As I walked past the massive ice sculpture, I locked eyes directly with Ashley. The young, arrogant woman from Connecticut looked as though she had just been struck by lightning. The color completely drained from her flawless face, and the crystal glass of champagne slipped from her fingers, shattering silently on the thick carpet. She recognized me instantly as the modest church clerk from her kitchen, but she was rapidly realizing I was actually the supposed dead wife she had been told was crazy. But I did not care about Ashley. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the main stage. Richard was completely paralyzed. His hands were still gripping the wooden podium, but his knuckles were entirely white. His handsome, perfectly composed face was undergoing a violent, terrifying transformation. The fake sorrow vanished, completely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted wildly toward the heavy exit doors toward Daniel and then back down to me. The flawless, confident monster who had abandoned me in the scorching desert was entirely gone, leaving behind a terrified, cornered rat. Daniel reacted slightly faster. The slick corporate lawyer immediately realized their entire criminal empire was standing on the precipice of absolute destruction. I saw his mind racing rapidly through 1,000 different legal strategies, trying to figure out how to instantly control this catastrophic situation. I finally reached the front of the room, stopping exactly 10 feet away from the wooden podium. I stood incredibly tall, refusing to let my dirty clothes make me feel small. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream. I did not ask him why he left me to die. I maintained the absolute terrifying power of my strategic silence. I simply stared up at him, letting the crushing weight of my survival suffocate him in front of his entire world. Richard desperately grabbed the only weapon he thought he still had left. He tried to violently force the narrative back into his control. "Caroline," he gasped loudly, his voice cracking with a perfectly manufactured mixture of shock and overwhelming relief. He practically threw himself down the short stairs of the stage, rushing toward me with his arms wide open. "Oh my God, it is an absolute miracle. You are alive. My beautiful wife has wandered all the way back to us." He stopped just a few feet away from me, clearly hesitating because the look in my eyes was incredibly cold and entirely unfamiliar to him. He turned quickly to the silent, shocked crowd, projecting his voice loudly across the room. "Please, everyone, stay completely calm," he announced, playing the role of the desperate, protective husband. "She is clearly in a state of severe shock. Her mental illness has completely consumed her. She has no idea where she is right now. Daniel, please call the hospital immediately and get a psychiatric transport team down here. We need to get her heavily medicated and safe." He reached out to grab my shoulders, intending to physically restrain me and drag me out of the room before I could speak a single word to the authorities. But before his expensive manicured hands could even touch my ruined clothes, Rebecca stepped forward, pulling me slightly back and slapping his hands away with a sharp, violent smack that echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Do not ever touch her, you arrogant monster," Rebecca said, her voice low but carrying an incredible, deadly authority. Richard stared at Rebecca, his eyes narrowing in sudden, sharp confusion. He had not seen her in 15 years, and time had completely changed her appearance. But as he looked deeply into her dark, unforgiving eyes, the terrifying recognition slowly dawned on his face. He realized exactly who she was, and he realized instantly that the two women he had systematically destroyed had somehow found each other in the dark. I did not give him a single second to process the nightmare he was standing in. I refused to engage in a screaming match. I refused to let him twist my words or gaslight the crowd into thinking I was a hysterical, paranoid woman. I looked away from his terrified face and tilted my head up toward the dark balcony at the back of the ballroom, sitting in the shadows behind the massive, glowing audio mixing board. The young technician was watching me intently. He had his hand resting firmly on the master volume slider, waiting for my command. I gave him a single sharp nod. The young man instantly brought his hand down. The massive professional speakers mounted in every single corner of the lavish ballroom cracked to life with a loud, sharp burst of electronic static. The entire crowd flinched at the sudden deafening noise. And then the crystal-clear, incredibly loud audio recording we had captured from his home office began to play directly over the main public address system for every single person in the room to hear. The sharp burst of electronic static was immediately followed by the booming, unmistakable voice of my husband. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings and bounced against the crystal chandeliers with absolute crystal clarity. "I do not care what time it is, Daniel, get over here right this second." The raw fury in Richard's recorded voice tore through the elegant ballroom like a massive, invisible wrecking ball. Every single person in the room flinched. The mayor, who had just been wiping a sympathetic tear from his cheek, froze with his handkerchief pressed tightly against his face. The wealthy investors in the front row stiffened in their expensive seats. On the stage, Richard's face drained of every single drop of color, turning the exact shade of pale, wet ash. He frantically looked around the room as if searching for a hidden switch to turn off the nightmare currently playing out in front of his elite peers. But there was no switch. The young audio technician in the balcony had completely locked the master system, and my husband's own voice continued to absolutely damn him. The recorded audio was completely unforgiving. The guests listened in absolute stunned silence as Daniel's voice joined the track. "It is not that simple, big brother," the slick lawyer voice echoed through the speakers, dripping with arrogant leverage. We are no longer just hiding money from a naive dependent housewife. We are actively covering up a murder. If the highway patrol finds her body before the natural elements destroy the evidence, I am the one who has to legally defend you. I am the one forging the property deeds. A collective massive gasp ripped through the crowd of 500 people. Women covered their mouths in pure horror. Men grabbed the edges of their tables. The church elders who had just bowed their heads in solemn prayer for my soul were now staring at the man on the stage with absolute burning disgust. Richard lunged toward the main podium, desperately yanking at the thick black cables connected to the microphone, thinking it would somehow sever the audio feed. But the sound was not coming from the stage. It was coming from the massive professional speakers mounted high on the walls, perfectly surrounding the entire audience. He was completely trapped inside his own confession. I want 50% Daniel. Recorded voice stated flatly, completely devoid of any human empathy. I want half of the $1.2 million currently sitting in the trust, and I want exactly half of the $3 million life insurance payout when we file the claim next week. I stood perfectly still in the center aisle, watching Richard completely unravel. He looked like a man drowning in a glass cage. He scrambled toward the edge of the stage, screaming at the catering staff to find the control room. But nobody moved to help him. The wealthy elite of our town were absolutely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the evil being broadcast into their ears. And then came the absolute final fatal blow. The recording played the exact moment Richard had sealed his fate, not just with the law, but with the very community he relied on for his wealth. "You greedy bastard," Richard's voice hissed through the speakers. "I built this entire empire. I married the woman. I dealt with her boring, pathetic existence for 18 years just to secure that capital. I was the one who looked her right in the eyes and left her in the desert. And now I have to stand in front of all these hypocritical fools tonight and pretend to cry. Look at these wealthy idiots sitting in the front row, Daniel. They are going to hand us the perfect alibi wrapped in a neat little bow because they are too stupid to see past a nice suit and a fake charity fund." The ballroom erupted into total chaos. The absolute disrespect, the casual, vicious mockery of the very people he had invited to mourn me was the spark that ignited a massive inferno of outrage. The prominent business partners who had invested millions into his corporate firm stood up from their chairs, their faces red with absolute fury. The police chief who played golf with him every Sunday stood up, placing his hand instinctively on his duty belt, staring at Richard with a look of profound betrayal. But nobody reacted faster or more violently than Ashley. The young blonde woman from Connecticut had been standing near the back of the room, absorbing every single word of the recording. The truth had finally shattered her beautiful, expensive delusion. She finally realized that she was never the queen of his empire. She was never his true love. She was absolutely nothing more than a convenient pawn, a temporary distraction, and a vulnerable incubator for his legacy. She realized that the man she was fighting for was perfectly willing to murder his wife and forge legal documents just to avoid sharing a bank account. Ashley did not shrink away in tears. She marched forward, grabbing a completely full glass of deep red wine from a paralyzed waiter tray. She pushed her way aggressively through the crowd of shocked guests, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. She marched straight up to the edge of the stage where Richard was still desperately trying to shout over the loudspeakers. Richard saw her approaching and stepped forward, reaching out his hands as if he could somehow charm her into submission. "Ashley, please," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "It is a fake. It is a completely fabricated digital recording. She is trying to frame me." Ashley did not say a single word. She simply pulled her arm back and threw the entire glass of red wine directly into his perfectly handsome face. The dark liquid splashed violently against his skin, soaking his expensive Italian suit and dripping down his pristine white shirt like fresh blood. The heavy crystal glass slipped from her hand and shattered loudly against the wooden stage. "You absolute monster!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the chaos of the room. "You told me she was crazy. You told me the money was completely secure. I let you hold my son. I let you build a life in my house while you were planning a murder. You are nothing but a pathetic, lying sociopath." Richard wiped the red wine from his eyes, his hands shaking violently. He looked out at the massive crowd and finally realized that his flawless reputation was completely incinerated. There was no charming his way out of this. There was no legal loophole that could erase the sound of his own voice admitting to leaving me to die in the desert. Daniel, being the highly calculating coward that he was, realized the exact same thing. While Richard was busy getting humiliated by his young mistress, Daniel had slowly and quietly backed away from the center of the stage. He was edging toward the heavy velvet curtains that concealed the rear kitchen exit. He knew that the audio recording, coupled with my physical presence in the room, provided more than enough probable cause for an immediate arrest. I was actively calculating his flight risk, deciding to abandon his brother entirely to save his own skin. He spun around and bolted for the heavy swinging kitchen doors. But he did not even make it 3 steps. Federal Agent Hayes, who had been sitting quietly at a corner table wearing a highly convincing tuxedo, stood up immediately. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out his gold federal badge, holding it high in the air. FBI, he shouted, his voice commanding absolute total authority over the panicked crowd. Nobody move a single muscle. At that exact moment, the man sitting directly next to the mayor stood up as well. He was the undercover agent who had been posing as the senior insurance adjuster specifically sent to process Richard's massive fraudulent claim. He pulled a heavy black radio from his pocket and spoke sharply into the microphone. "Bring them in now." The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open, and a dozen uniformed local police officers alongside several plainclothes federal agents flooded into the room. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. 2 large federal agents burst through the rear kitchen doors, intercepting Daniel Wright as he tried to push his way outside. They tackled the arrogant corporate lawyer directly to the polished floor, driving their knees forcefully into his expensive suit jacket. "Get your hands off me," Daniel screamed, thrashing wildly against the floor. "I am a licensed attorney. You have absolutely no warrant for this. This is an illegal detention. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud." Agent Hayes stated calmly, walking toward the stage with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs glinting in the light. He grabbed Daniel's arms, twisting them painfully behind his back and snapping the metal cuffs shut with a loud, satisfying click. "You are also being charged with massive financial forgery, interstate extortion, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. You have the right to remain completely silent. I highly suggest you use it, counselor." On the main stage, Richard had completely collapsed. His knees buckled and he fell to the wooden floor, sitting in the puddle of spilled red wine and shattered crystal. He was breathing heavily, staring blankly out at the crowd of people who used to worship his financial brilliance. The local police chief walked slowly up the short stairs of the stage, shaking his head in absolute disgust. "Stand up, Richard," the police chief ordered, his voice heavy with contempt. Richard did not move. He just stared down at his shaking hands. The police chief grabbed him by the collar of his ruined suit and hauled him forcefully to his feet, spinning him around and slamming him face first into the wooden podium. He pulled Richard's arms back and clamped the cold steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. As the police began to read Richard his Miranda rights, the absolute reality of his destruction finally set in. His major corporate investors were actively pulling out their cell phones, furiously dialing their legal teams to immediately sever all financial ties with his firm. The church elders were turning their backs, refusing to even look at him. His multi-million-dollar empire, built entirely on lies, manipulation, and the stolen labor of the women he abused, was dissolving into absolute nothingness in front of his eyes. He had lost his money. He had lost his pristine reputation. He had lost his freedom. He had absolutely nothing left. I stood in the center aisle, watching the men drag my husband and his brother off the stage. Rebecca stepped closer, wrapping her arm firmly around my waist, holding me steady. We did not smile. We did not gloat. We simply watched the monsters who had systematically destroyed our lives get paraded out of the ballroom in heavy metal chains. The crushing, suffocating imbalance of power that had kept me paralyzed in fear for 18 years was finally completely shattered. The men who thought they could casually erase us from the world were now facing decades in a federal prison cell, while we stood in the light entirely victorious, absolutely unbroken, and completely free. The heavy polished oak doors of the federal courthouse closed behind me with a solid, satisfying thud. 7 months had passed since that chaotic night at the country club. But stepping into this completely sterile, brightly lit temple of justice felt like stepping into an entirely new universe. The air inside the courtroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. It was a massive contrast to the suffocating heat and red dust of the desert where my nightmare originally began. I walked down the center aisle wearing a sharply tailored pearl white suit. I chose the color deliberately. It was the absolute antithesis of the filthy, ruined clothes I wore during my staged resurrection. Today I was not a ghost or a victim. I was the architect of their total destruction. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, resting my hands calmly on the smooth wooden surface. Across the wide aisle, sitting at the defense table, were the 2 men who had systematically tried to erase my entire existence. The arrogant, wealthy aura that used to follow Richard like a shadow was completely gone. He was wearing a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair had grown out into a messy graying mop, and his handsome face was deeply lined with the profound exhaustion of a man who had spent the last several months sleeping on a thin cot in a federal holding facility. Sitting right next to him was Daniel. The slick corporate lawyer was no longer wearing his expensive imported silk suits. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting tan jacket, and he refused to make eye contact with anyone in the room. The presiding federal judge, a deeply stern woman with decades of experience, banged her wooden gavel sharply against her desk. The final sentencing and civil restitution hearing was officially underway. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the meticulous, methodical dismantling of their entire criminal empire. The judge started with the massive suburban home Richard and Daniel had tried to steal from me. The prosecuting attorney presented the original faxed property transfer deed that I had discovered sitting on Daniel's desk. Alongside the deed, they presented the sworn testimony of a highly respected forensic handwriting expert. The expert had easily proven that the signature on the document was a masterfully executed forgery. But the prosecution did not stop there. They introduced the digital audio recording from the country club, where Daniel openly admitted to forging the property documents. The judge looked down at the two brothers with absolute burning disgust. She declared the property transfer contract entirely null and void, effective immediately. The Delaware Limited Liability Shell Company they had created to hold the stolen asset was legally dissolved. The massive, beautiful house I had spent 15 years turning into a home was officially and completely returned to my name. But the house was only the very beginning. Next came the extremely complicated web of offshore accounts and the irrevocable trust fund that held my stolen retirement money. Daniel had built that trust using incredibly sophisticated legal loopholes. He had designed it to be completely untouchable in a standard divorce court. But federal court was an entirely different battlefield, because the initial seed money for the trust was obtained through highly documented fraud, extortion, and a documented murder conspiracy. The judge ruled that the trust itself was a product of severe criminal enterprise. Listening to the judge read the financial ruling was like listening to a beautiful symphony. She legally dissolved the trust fund completely. Every single penny of the $1.2 million stolen from my personal retirement accounts was ordered to be returned directly to my primary control. Furthermore, the massive luxury mansion in Connecticut that Richard had purchased for Ashley was officially seized by the federal government. The property was ordered to be liquidated at a public auction, with the proceeds going directly toward compensating me for massive civil damages and severe emotional distress. Ashley had packed up her son and moved back to her mother house in Boston the very morning after the country club incident. She left Richard with absolutely nothing but a hollow, empty house that now belonged entirely to the bank and to me. While Richard was facing decades behind bars for attempted murder and federal wire fraud, I directed a massive portion of my newly recovered wealth toward entirely annihilating Daniel. I did not just want the corrupt lawyer to go to prison. I wanted his entire prestigious law firm to burn to the ground. I hired a team of the most vicious, ruthless civil litigators in the entire state. We launched a massive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against his legal practice, citing severe legal malpractice, gross negligence, and active participation in a federal criminal conspiracy. The civil suit ripped through his firm like a massive hurricane. We successfully pierced the corporate veil, proving that Daniel had used the firm's vast resources, legal stationery, and notary stamps to facilitate the theft of my assets. The moment the federal indictment was handed down, his wealthy senior partners completely abandoned him. They desperately tried to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal, but it was entirely too late. The negative publicity was absolutely catastrophic. Their wealthy elite clients withdrew their massive retainer fees overnight, refusing to be associated with a firm that actively helped murder wealthy wives for insurance money. Within 4 months, Daniel's prestigious law firm was completely insolvent. They were forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, permanently closing their heavy glass doors. Daniel was entirely stripped of his legal license, formally disbarred, and permanently banned from practicing law in any capacity for the rest of his natural life. He was completely ruined financially, professionally, and socially long before the federal judge even handed down his criminal prison sentence. As I sat in the courtroom watching the judge systematically strip away every single asset they owned, I felt a profound, deep sense of closure. But my absolute victory was only half of the story being told in that courthouse today. After the judge finalized my financial restitution, she called for a brief recess before moving on to the secondary docket. When the court reconvened, the heavy oak doors opened once again, and Rebecca walked proudly down the center aisle. She was wearing a beautiful, tailored navy blue dress. Her dark eyes were bright and incredibly clear, completely devoid of the heavy, tired sorrow she had carried for 15 long years. She took her seat at the witness stand, raising her right hand and swearing to tell the whole truth. And for the first time in over a decade, the legal system actually listened to her. With the help of Federal Agent Hayes, Rebecca had officially filed a massive motion to entirely reopen her original family court case. The evidence we had gathered to destroy Richard's present life was the exact key needed to unlock the horrific secrets of his past. Agent Hayes presented the judge with heavily documented proof of Richard's long-standing pattern of severe psychological abuse. He presented the digital audio recording, where Richard openly admitted to using the exact same gaslighting tactics on both of us. He admitted to manipulating the system specifically to steal money and avoid paying alimony. But the most devastating piece of evidence came directly from Daniel's seized legal files. During the FBI raid on the bankrupt law firm, agents had uncovered the original medical files from 15 years ago. They found clear, undeniable paper trails proving that Daniel had actively bribed a corrupt local psychiatrist to sign the involuntary commitment papers that had originally sent Rebecca to a state hospital. They proved that her supposed severe schizophrenia was a completely fabricated diagnosis designed solely to terminate her parental rights. The federal judge, a woman who had seen decades of terrible crimes, was visibly shaken by the sheer calculated cruelty of their actions. She looked at Rebecca with deep, profound sympathy. She officially overturned every single ruling from the original divorce and custody proceedings. She legally completely expunged the involuntary psychiatric hold from Rebecca's permanent medical record, officially declaring her a completely sane, fit, and loving mother who was the victim of a massive criminal conspiracy. But the absolute most beautiful moment of the entire grueling day did not involve money or property deeds. It involved the two young women sitting quietly in the very back row of the courtroom. They were 19 and 21 years old now. They were beautiful, smart young women who had grown up in an incredibly wealthy, isolated bubble. For 15 years, Richard had completely poisoned their minds, telling them that their biological mother was a dangerous, violently unstable woman who did not love them. He had strictly forbidden them from ever trying to contact her. But the massive public fallout from the country club incident and the subsequent highly publicized federal trial had shattered that toxic bubble completely. The two girls had finally learned the absolute horrifying truth about the man who raised them. They learned that the lavish lifestyle they enjoyed was built entirely on the stolen wealth and the broken minds of the women he discarded. When the judge officially struck down the old custody order declaring Rebecca an innocent victim of severe abuse, I turned around in my chair. I watched the two girls stand up from the heavy wooden benches. Their faces were streaming with tears. They did not look at their father sitting in his orange jumpsuit at the defense table. They did not even glance in his direction. They walked straight down the center aisle toward the witness stand. Rebecca stood up, her hands trembling violently, her breath catching in her throat. She had waited 15 years for this exact moment. She had survived poverty, isolation, and profound heartbreak, just hoping that one day the universe would correct this massive, terrible wrong. The girls walked through the small wooden swinging gate that separated the gallery from the court floor. They practically ran the last few steps, throwing their arms around Rebecca in a massive, desperate embrace. The sound of their shared weeping echoed loudly through the silent courtroom. It was the sound of 15 years of stolen time finally collapsing into a single, beautiful moment of absolute healing. Richard sat at the defense table, completely paralyzed, watching his entire legacy officially reject him. He had spent his entire life obsessively accumulating wealth-hoarding power and completely controlling the narrative. But in the end, he could not bribe his way out of this room. He could not charm the federal judge, and he absolutely could not stop his own flesh and blood from discovering that he was a monster. The judge allowed the emotional reunion to continue for several long minutes before gently calling the court back to order. She looked down at Richard and Daniel, her expression entirely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. She systematically handed down their respective federal sentences, ensuring that neither man would breathe the free air outside a prison yard for at least 25 long years. When the heavy gavel finally fell for the absolute last time, officially closing the massive legal chapter of our lives, I stood up from my chair. I gathered my neat leather portfolio, feeling incredibly light. I did not look back at the defense table as the armed federal marshals grabbed the two brothers by their arms and led them through the heavy side door back to their concrete cells. They were completely irrelevant to my future now. I walked out of the courtroom and stepped into the massive sunlit hallway of the federal building. Rebecca was waiting for me near the towering glass windows, standing proudly with her two beautiful daughters firmly by her side. She looked at me, and a wide, brilliant smile spread across her face. We had walked into the absolute darkest depths of hell together, and we had somehow managed to drag each other back out into the light entirely victorious. The financial ruin they planned for me was officially reversed. The family they stole from her was officially returned. We had completely rewritten the brutal ending they designed for us, and turned it into our own powerful beginning. The morning sun filters beautifully through the massive bay windows of a restored historic brick building on Main Street. The cool coastal air drifting in from the ocean is a stark, refreshing contrast to the suffocating, blistering heat of the desert that nearly claimed my life. Inside the shop, the atmosphere is thick with a truly intoxicating aromatic blend of freshly roasted espresso beans, dark chocolate, and damp sweet earth. I stand securely behind a polished, reclaimed wood counter, wiping the smooth surface down with a clean white cotton towel. Across the bright, expansive room, Rebecca is carefully arranging a massive, vibrant display of yellow tulips and delicate white hydrangeas. We are 3,000 miles away from the toxic suburban nightmare we left behind, and we are finally breathing entirely on our own terms. Using a carefully measured portion of the federal restitution funds and the liquidated assets from the seized Connecticut mansion, we completely relocated to a quiet, supportive coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. We purchased this abandoned historic storefront and spent 6 grueling, satisfying months physically renovating it with our very own hands. We stripped the old lid paint, we sanded the original hardwood floors until our shoulders ached, and we built exactly what we wanted from the ground up. The business we created is a unique dual concept. Half of the sprawling space is a thriving artisan cafe serving local pastries and rich coffee, while the other half is a full-service professional floral design studio. It is a loving homage to the independent career I had before Richard systematically dismantled my confidence. But this beautiful brick building is much more than just a profitable place to buy a morning latte or a custom wedding bouquet. It is a dedicated sanctuary. When Rebecca and I designed our business model, we made a quiet but fiercely strict pact regarding our hiring practices. We specifically seek out and employ women who have massive, unexplained gaps in their professional resumes. We hire women who are actively escaping severe domestic abuse, women who have barely survived terrible, financially devastating divorces, and women who simply need a safe, quiet place to rebuild their shattered sense of self-worth. Just last week, a young woman walked through our heavy glass front door. She was wearing dark sunglasses indoors, and her hands were trembling violently as she ordered a simple cup of black tea. I recognized that specific, terrifying physical tremor immediately. It is the exact same vibration of pure panic that lived deep inside my own bones the day I stood stranded on Interstate 40 watching my husband drive away. I did not ask her any invasive, probing questions. I did not offer her empty pity. I simply slid a warm blueberry pastry across the counter completely free of charge and handed her one of our heavy embossed business cards. I told her we were currently looking for a reliable assistant manager and that she did not need any prior retail experience. I told her we only required a willingness to learn and a deep, burning desire to stand firmly on her own 2 feet. When she finally took off her sunglasses, her eyes were heavily bruised and completely brimming with tears. She started working for us the very next morning. Watching the debilitating fear slowly drain from her, posture over the last 7 days has been the absolute greatest return on investment I have ever experienced in my entire life. The profound healing extends far beyond our employees. Rebecca's oldest daughter, who was ruthlessly stolen from her 15 years ago by a corrupt legal system, is currently spending her entire summer vacation working the espresso machine. Hearing the bright, genuine laughter shared openly between a mother and the child she fought so incredibly hard to get back is a daily absolute miracle. The 15 years of stolen time can never be fully refunded by any judge, but their entire future is now completely theirs to write. Rebecca is no longer the frantic, desperate woman gripping a steering wheel in the desert trying to survive the madness of a gaslighting husband. She is an incredibly grounded, fierce matriarch holding her reunited family together with strong hands that smell constantly of rich vanilla and fresh eucalyptus. I have experienced a massive, fundamental transformation myself. I am the primary financial controller of this entire commercial enterprise. I handle every single ledger, every tax document, and every corporate banking account. When the monthly bank statements arrive, I do not blindly hand them over to a man in a tailored suit. I sit down at my desk, I open the envelopes, and I read every single line item until I fully understand exactly where our capital is moving. I carry a heavy leather wallet filled with credit cards and debit cards that bear only my name. The profound, liberating weight of absolute financial independence is a feeling I will absolutely never take for granted again. I learned the hardest, most terrifying way possible that delegating your financial security to someone else is the exact equivalent of handing them a loaded weapon and simply hoping they never decide to pull the trigger. Sometimes when the shop is completely quiet and the afternoon rain is tapping softly against the front windows, I pour myself a hot cup of dark roast coffee and I allow myself to think about Richard. According to the official federal registry, my former husband is currently residing in a maximum security federal penitentiary located in the freezing bitter cold of the northern Rust Belt. The federal judge presiding over his criminal case did not show him a single ounce of mercy or leniency. I was officially sentenced to 15 consecutive years behind bars with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The stark, brutal reality of his current daily existence is the ultimate delivery of absolute justice. The arrogant, wealthy man who used to complain bitterly to hotel managers about the thread count of his imported Italian sheets is now sleeping every single night on a 2-inch stiff foam mattress resting over a bolted steel slab. The respected corporate wealth advisor who wore custom-tailored European suits and drank incredibly expensive aged scotch is now wearing a scratchy bright orange jumpsuit and eating heavily processed synthetic food from a divided plastic tray. He has absolutely no liquid assets. He has no elite country club memberships to hide behind. He has no eager, gullible young mistress waiting for him on the outside. Ashley completely vanished the very moment his bank accounts were frozen and the luxury mansion was seized, taking their child and leaving him entirely alone to face the catastrophic consequences of his own greed. His younger brother, Daniel, is currently sitting in a completely different federal prison facility, hundreds of miles away. Daniel is permanently disbarred, completely bankrupted, and universally disgraced by the legal community he used to manipulate so effortlessly. The two brothers who casually plotted to end my life over a glass of expensive bourbon are now completely isolated, stripped of their enormous power and forced to wake up every single morning staring blankly at cold gray concrete walls. Richard truly believed he could simply leave me in a massive open desert to die in the dirt, but he is the one who ultimately ended up permanently trapped inside a tiny, inescapable cage. I recently received a formal legal letter from the federal prosecutor's office informing me that Richard's initial criminal appeals had been entirely rejected by the higher courts. He tried to argue that his massive sentence was overly harsh, but the appellate judges threw his paperwork out without even granting a formal hearing. Reading that official letter standing in the middle of my beautiful, thriving flower shop, I felt the very last lingering shadow of fear completely evaporate from my soul. He can never hurt me again. He can never touch my bank accounts, he can never forge my signature, and he can absolutely never silence my voice. The massive, terrifying storm he forced me to walk through did not destroy me. It stripped away every single layer of naive dependency I was carrying and exposed a core of absolute pure titanium that I never even knew I possessed. I lost 18 years of my life to a manipulative criminal psychopath, but I gained an entire remaining lifetime of absolute total freedom. I wake up every single morning surrounded by the incredibly beautiful, vibrant colors of fresh blooming flowers and the strong, resilient women who help me run this sanctuary. We are building a massive, unshakable empire based entirely on mutual support, financial transparency, and the unyielding strength of female solidarity. Many people say that women in their 50s should just quietly endure the hardships of a bad marriage and simply accept whatever cards they are dealt. They tell us that starting over at this age is completely impossible, and that we should just be grateful for whatever scraps of security a man is willing to provide. But they completely forget that years of silent sacrifice do not weaken us. Those years teach us how to expertly manage the most violent, unpredictable storms. Those years teach us how to navigate the deepest, treacherous waters. Do not ever let anyone convince you that you are entirely dependent on their presence for your survival. Never sign any legal documents or financial papers that you do not fully and completely understand. Ask the hard, uncomfortable questions, demand total transparency, and absolutely never let anyone hold the steering wheel of your life. Your financial independence is the absolute strongest armor you will ever wear in this world. If you enjoyed watching this massive plot twist unfold, and if you loved seeing a deeply arrogant monster completely destroyed by the very woman he tried to throw away, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done if you were left alone on that highway. Keep your eyes completely open, keep your bank accounts entirely secure, and always remember your own incredible, immense worth. See you strong ladies in the next story.